Thank you very much for having me here. I remember with pleasure lots of talks I have attended at Temple, and I've seen that you have a beautiful room now where I'm effectively part of the window, so to speak, and people, passerbys, hopefully will be enticed to also come along, who knows. I'm extremely honored to blab about my most recent book. And the book I've published with an Italian co-author based at Hong Kong University is called Sino-Japanese Power Politics, Might, Money and Minds. It's actually a side project of my PhD, because I conducted fieldwork between 2012 and 2014 on a project focusing on leadership in Japan's foreign policy making, specifically Japan's China policy making. And one of the main characters, so to speak, of my PhD was Abe under his first administration, 2006 and 2007. And it was a mixed blessing to see that the foreign policy team that Abe had handpicked in 2006, 2007 came back to power with a thunder in late 2012. And Abe showed a remarkable degree of consistency in his China foreign policy, not least because the people in charge of Abe's broad foreign policy outlook have been exactly the same. And we will look at some of these issues during the presentation. Now, since time is short, I would like to jump into the presentation, and I will focus on the big picture. Since we are in a university, I will give you some theoretical insights, very brief and short theoretical insights, but my presentation will give you a broad overview of the major trends we have seen developing, both me and Aurelio, in CISA, in Japan-China relations, especially since 2012. And the broad argument is quite simple. The argument is that since the standoff between Japan and China over the disputed Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, since the nationalization of 3 of these islets in the East China Sea, Japan and China have played by the power politics book with a crescendo. And not just in standard traditional military security, but also in terms of making active use of law enforcement agencies for realist purposes, that is to showcase strength and adopt a resolute stand vis-à-vis the counterpart. But the most interesting part has been the use of economic levers, nominally money, for political, if not geopolitical purposes. The other interesting development that we have noticed is the engagement, especially on the Japanese side, we would claim it's very new, with strategic communications. And so the active use of words and deeds to send signals to China and third-party actors to win hearts and minds. And so we argue that Japan and China relations were effectively characterized by realist thinking in all 3 different stages, in all 3 different levels of a chessboard game that has affected bilateral relations. And so this game has been played at the military security level, at the economic level, and at the information level. And this is particularly fascinating because it speaks to wider trends in international society. What is also fascinating is that, if you want, one of the key arguments that comes from the book, and that is probably of interest to people interested in Japanese foreign policy, is that Japan has abided more and more to a realist logic in its foreign policy. And this is a relatively new development if you look at the strategic use of economic levers vis-à-vis China and the use of propaganda, broadly defined vis-à-vis China. And so what we argue basically is that Japan has socialized, in a sense, and has been playing the Chinese game because that's how realist thinking goes. If a major country pushes the envelope in a markedly zero-sum fashion, it is very easy for the counterpart to get embroiled into the same kind of game. So, back to square one. What is the broad structure that defines our theoretical understanding? The broad structure is quite simple. It is premised on the changing power balance in East Asia, nominally the re-emergence of China to regional centrality, and the gradual relative decline of the United States of America. And this relative decline of the United States of America has been evident already, we would argue, from the second George W. Bush administration. Even prior to the advent of the Obama administration, the US has followed a foreign policy that has been much more sympathetic to the State Department line of making China a responsible stakeholder and accommodating, to a certain extent, to China's rise. And what this has meant is that, especially since 2008, China has taken advantage of the changing structure of the international environment, and this is why this broad theory is called structural realism. China has taken advantage of the changing structure of the international environment to push its claims in the East China Sea and also in the South China Sea, as we will see. And as it's evident from the publication of a Japanese think tank devoted to maritime affairs, the Japanese government especially, and some Japanese circles, have understood early on in the mid-2000s China's advancement into the seas as a rising dragon where Asia turns red, as is clearly evident from the cover of this book that is roughly translated as China's advancement into the oceans or into the seas. And this has been made possible not just because of China's rise in material capabilities per se, but also because of China's more aggressive foreign policy. And so the threat perceptions on the Japanese side have been clearly heightened. And that's triggering a specific foreign policy output. Now, this foreign policy output is not automatic, right? States are not billiard balls, as they say in international relations theory, but states are populated by leaders made up of flesh and bones individuals with their own ideological biases, their own worldview, and their own understanding and appreciation of their own country's stance in the world stage. And we argue in the book that this increasingly realist zero-sum interaction between Japan and China has been favored by the very forceful leadership of Abe Shinzo on the right side and Xi Jinping on the left side. Now, this is particularly important because it is precisely at times of major international fluctuations, when the international structure changes, it is particularly important to notice the role of leadership and how leadership affects changes in terms of broad foreign policy outputs and also ripple effects in wider international society. You clearly have in mind one example, which is the Donald J. Trump administration. Why is the Donald J. Trump administration so impactful on the international state? Not just because it's the United States of America that has prominent power in the world arena, but it's also precisely because of the fluctuation in international politics that grants leaders to impact more forcefully on on the world stage. And this has been true prior to Trump, has been true of the leaders from China and Japan. And so personality can have substantial effects. Surprisingly so, because not just China, but especially Japan, have been depicted, especially in the post-Cold War years, as the countries of consensual leadership, the countries of broad agreements and understandings on foreign policy lines that are shared not just within the government, but also with the bureaucrats, with the business community, and public opinion at large. We clearly see the rise of idiosyncratic leadership that has a specific ideological outlook. Now, the impact on foreign policy within the state has been allowed effectively by the centralization of power that we have seen in both China and Japan. Top-down leadership, strong grip on the foreign policy making machine. And in Japan's case, as I mentioned earlier, we see a remarkable consistency of personalities being cherry-picked in the national security apparatus. And so in Japan's case, as depicted on the right side, we see the role of influential advisors, such as Yachi Shotaro, who have been playing a substantial influence in the first Abe administration as Abe's so-called diplomatic brain, rising back to the forefront of Japanese politics as he became the national security advisor and the head of the National Security Secretariat. And the same applies also to perhaps a similar extent to Xi Jinping. And what is important here to understand is that in Japan's case, the clear thinking in one line of the Abe administration vis-à-vis China is that China respects strength. And so you deal with China from a position of strength. And it's precisely on this understanding that you see the inauguration of initiatives that reflect precisely what had been going on in 2006 and 2007. So to recap, and this, I promise you, is the last theoretical slide, the broad understanding that I and Aurelio have is a so-called neoclassical realist understanding, where changes in the international system, nominally the rise of China and the relative decline of the US, allow for major changes in the foreign policy of both China and Japan. China becomes more aggressive. Japan becomes more frightened and threatened by China's advancement into the seas. But it takes a leader like Abe to translate those threat perceptions into foreign policy output. If we were to substitute, for instance, Hatoyama with Abe here, we would have a different foreign policy, in my opinion. Or perhaps a failed foreign policy, as it actually happens, if we want to complicate the picture with domestic politics. So, what we have seen is, first of all, the centralization of policy making within both China and Japan. And what we try to do in the book, and we try to do in what I try to do in this presentation, is to give you a sense of how these initiatives are almost similar to the counterparts initiatives. This is a very fascinating story, and we use sources Japanese for the Japan section and Chinese for the China section to give you a sense of the view from the inside. So in China's case, we have the establishment of new institutions, such as the National Security Commission. We have Xi Jinping having a strong grip on the foreign policy machine through the so-called small leading groups. And you have two leaders that have been consistently enamored with a strategic foreign policy, one that is long-term oriented. And this strategic foreign policy is also the byproduct of the longevity, the political longevity of both the Chinese and the Japanese leaders. So as you probably know, in the last Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, it has been sanctioned that there has been a removal of the two mandates for the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping's thought has also been enshrined into the party constitution. In Japan's case, you have the establishment of a National Security Council. You have Japan's first ever national security strategy, and Yachi, together with also Kitaoka, Shinichi, were responsible for crafting this national security strategy, along with other people in Kantei. And you have a set of national security legislations that have, some would argue, changed. Certainly, some would dispute whether it has been a revolutionary change or not, but it has changed Japan's security profile. And as we know, Abe has been remarkably strong in terms of political longevity, and in all likelihood he will also be confirmed at the LDP presidential elections in September of this year, likely becoming the most long-lasting Japanese prime minister in modern Japanese history ever. Now, this grip on the foreign policy machine has translated, interestingly enough, in a fairly consistent type of hold on the bureaucratic machine, to the extent that we can talk about Sontaku Seiji also in China, not just Japan. You have a politicized bureaucracy that is induced through carrots, but also especially sticks, such as the stick that is the cabinet personnel bureau, the personnel bureau within the Kantei, that de facto punishes bureaucrats that are not necessarily towing the Abe line. And so you have forceful leadership that translates into foreign policy outputs through the bureaucratic machine. One thing that we see in the Chinese case is the progressive militarization of the Coast Guard ships, of the Coast Guard forces, that ended up with the recent inclusion of the Chinese Coast Guards in the People's Armed Police. So effectively, Xi Jinping will have control over the Coast Guard through the Central Military Commission. And you have Xi Jinping, as reports from Japan seem to confirm, having a strong grip on foreign policy, especially on the maritime, on securing maritime interests in the East and South China Sea. So Xi Jinping has been particularly forceful in pushing the boundaries for a more risk-prone foreign policy in the East and South China Sea. And you clearly see this with the progressive militarization also of disputed territories, not islands, God forbid, in the South China Sea. In Japan's case, you see Abe consistently pushing not just for security reforms back home, but you see Abe pushing for a deepening of the US-Japan alliance, and at the same time opening the strategic possibilities of Japan by enhancing the strategic partnerships and inaugurating strategic partnerships with maritime states that might push back China's advancement into the seas. And this thinking comes from the people behind Abe. Yachi Shotaro and his right-hand man, Kanehara Nobukatsu, are clear in their writings that Japan needs to pursue a maritime strategy that de facto secures the rimlands. And this is thinking that comes from Alfred Mahan, a naval thinker, an American naval thinker, where Japan basically needs to build up its own intent with the United States, Australia, and India to push back the continental powers' advancement into the sea. And so this maritime thinking has translated into the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity in 2006 and 2007, and it has translated into the Asian Democratic Security Diamond, and more recently, the slogan has changed into a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is de facto Japan backing up the Trump administration's recently unveiled national security strategy. And one consistent proof of our claim comes from none less than the primary interviews that I did, the elite interviews I did while doing fieldwork in Japan, but also leaked State Department cables from WikiLeaks, where Japanese government officials have been adamant to US counterparts in claiming that Abe was absolutely stubborn about the inclusion of reference to the Quad in negotiations with India. So Abe wanted clearly to push for interoperability and broader coordination and jointness, if you want, between these maritime states. And so why do you see consistency? Because the Quad has been recently back into fashion as of November of last year. We have to see whether it will last for more than its predecessor, because it didn't, because there were reservations in countries such as Australia, India, and to a certain extent also in the United States of America, where the State Department and Condoleezza Rice were not entirely happy eventually with the Quad pushback. But the Trump administration has espoused this idea, and you see a consistency between 2006 and 2018. So our thinking and our book, which came out last year, has been spot on and confirmed in recent developments as well. The other part of the story, which is possibly the most interesting and appealing part, together with the propaganda part, is the development in terms of active use of economic levers for political, if not geopolitical, reasons. In the 1990s, you might recall that the standard story, the standard narrative, was about economic prosperity and about engaging China into the economic world order, such as allowing China to accede and to become part of the World Trade Organization. Everybody would have everybody would have benefited from the fruit of prosperity, not least because of the economic complementarity between countries such as Japan, which was and is a capital-rich country, and countries such as China, which is a labor-intensive country. So the thinking was win-win thinking and economic interdependence thinking, not least because of regional production networks. Fast forward to 2017, 2018, and the thinking has changed. The thinking now is that China has been allowed to cheap ride on the international liberal trade system, economic system, through market distortions and a state-sanctioned market economy, state-driven market economy. And we also see a China that has developed economic asymmetries vis-à-vis its neighbors. That is, that China is incredibly bigger relative to smaller countries, ranging from South Korea to Southeast Asian countries, all the way also, you might say, to Western and Eastern Europe. And China has not shied away from using its economic leverage vis-à-vis these countries for political purposes, through a policy of carrots and sticks. One clear example of this, as you might all be aware, is China's bullying of South Korea through the embargo of tourism, of K-pop concerts to take place in China, and also through the boycott, partly state-sanctioned at the beginning, of Lotte department stores. Because of the deployment of a THAAD missile system in, by the way, in land that was owned by the Lotte Group. And we have seen the same logic also in 2010 with vis-à-vis Japan, as China, in all likelihood, embargoed rare earth materials. And there are stories also that China targeted the department stores owned by the Okada family, which was then Foreign Ministry of Japan under the DPJ. And so you see clearly a targeting and a use of China's economic firepower for political and geopolitical purposes. And this has been translated eventually, and these are the fears that are associated with China's Mammoth Belt and Road Initiative, which envisions a set of investment programs and deeper economic interaction with countries in the Rimland all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, but also through the ancient Silk Road, all the way from Central Asia to Western Europe. The Abe government especially, and this has been confirmed by one of the main TPP negotiators, nominally Suzuki Hideo, who published a book through Asahi Shimbun 3-4 years ago. The Abe government especially, and the onset of the Senkaku-Ryōyu dispute has prompted the Japanese government to embrace the TPP for strategic reasons. So Abe has been extremely keen to embrace the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a multilateral free trade agreement with extremely high standards, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of investment and currency, possibly even currency manipulation. And of course, the underlying reason behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the need for the Japanese government to, and the American government earlier on, to avoid that the smaller economies around China's periphery would gravitate too quickly on China's side. So by providing an extremely generous free trade agreement that would have allowed the Vietnamese economy, for instance, to benefit enormously, much more than mature economies such as Japan or the United States. By allowing Vietnam to take part in the TPP, Vietnam would have been less influenced by Chinese economic leverage, right? So de facto, the TPP functions as a shield. And the same logic applies also to lesser and smaller economies in the Asia-Pacific, such as New Zealand and Australia. And if you followed the news, you are aware of the risk and the debate that has been ongoing in Australia about Chinese influence operations, not least through the use of economic levers vis-à-vis the Australian or the New Zealand economy. And so the logic has been, again, distinctively a realist logic, a zero-sum logic that has, among other benefits, such as the economic ones, it has a distinctively realist aim, which is to diffuse the Chinese influence, or in China's side, to augment its own influence. The other interesting development on the Japanese side has been the effective securitization of official development aid to build up Coast Guard institutions, not just in terms of providing ships, second-hand ships to countries such as Vietnam or the Philippines, but also in terms of training, providing training to Coast Guard captains from these countries that would have effectively bogged down China in theaters other than the East China Sea. So by empowering countries in the South China Sea, Japan would see its strategic space augmented. And it did so through an instrument that was traditionally aimed at poverty alleviation, which is official development aid assistance. And the capacity building has been ongoing. And again, the Kante has been in control of these initiatives, especially. Now, the other section, which requires a bit of an introduction, is the one on propaganda. Now, before I actually start this section, one other interesting 5 minutes? Yes. Another interesting section, yeah, okay, I'll jump into the section. Now, I try to use propaganda in the Italian original sense, which is a clinical definition of propaganda. The use of actions, words, and deeds for purposeful use of these actions, words, and deeds for persuasion of third parties. As you can see, this is the original building of the Catholic body responsible for propaganda activities. It's still there, and there is a propaganda street in Rome. One clear evolution we have seen is the use of strategic narratives from the Chinese and Japanese side. The depiction of China as a benevolent status quo country that confronts a revisionist aggressor that acts in defiance of the world order built following the anti-fascist World War II. And we see Japan playing up also its democratic and rule of law credentials to de facto win and score points in the global battle for hearts and minds vis-à-vis China. Now, I'll focus on the Japanese case because it's the most interesting, because you would expect this from China, but you wouldn't probably expect from Japan that the budget has been increasing by a degree of 300% in 2015, but the Kantei has been in charge of these initiatives to the extent that we have propaganda activities also in the narrow sense, where the Japanese government has been funding think tanks to pen anti-China messages that are then eventually signed by authoritative proxies, such as a former admiral or a former Secretary of State, a former Foreign Secretary. And this was a scoop by the Sunday Times, where the money was given secretly by the Japanese embassy in London to de facto have a think tank pen anti-China editorials. And of course, we also have the political use of Japanese policy banks also to secure the acquisition, for instance, of the Financial Times for the massive amount of $1.3 billion. When Nihon Keizai Shimbun was able to acquire the Financial Times because the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, and so effectively a policy bank, the government of Japan, understood that it was in the Japanese interest to have the Financial Times owned by a Japanese company. And so the Japan Bank for International Cooperation pooled resources from 3 mega banks plus 2 Japanese banks to provide liquidity and to provide loans for the Nihon Keizai Shimbun. And this is a particularly interesting development that sees the Japanese government stepping up its communication efforts also because of a substantial threat perception vis-à-vis China. And the need to convince really global public opinion and domestic audiences back home of the Japanese government's efforts internationally as well. Now, time is short, so I wouldn't deal into other interesting details of the book, but in the Q&A session, I guess, we can talk in more detail about the prospects of a Japan-China detente at last, as we have seen a Japan-China economic dialogue in April, and a bilateral summit between Premier Li Keqiang and Abe on the offsprings on the side of the trilateral summit between Japan, China, and South Korea. We are seeing Abe toning down his criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in fact agreeing to cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative. What does this mean? I think that this means that China is on a charm offensive, because China is very much concerned with the Trump administration's trade policies and the prospects of a trade war, but so is Japan, because of the substantial economic interests that Japan has in China. But scratch the surface of these budding signs of detente between Japan and China. I don't see a long-lasting, deep sense of overtures with clear deliverables from either the Japanese or the Chinese side. And perhaps if you want to know why this is the case, the best thing at this point would be probably to jump into the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Giulio. I promised you a very dynamic audience, which is why we asked you to end within the defined parameters. I have lots of questions, but I don't want to monopolize the control of the microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Giulio is a professor. He knows how to run these sessions, so I'll let you take the Q&A.
Please.
Yeah, Vice Admiral Fumiota, retired, JMSDF. And regarding this picture, I am not agree that detente. I think one of the reasons is the China are going to very friendly attitude when, only when, they have a very severe relation with the United States.
Yes.
The same as today's trade war. Yes. And also right after the Tiananmen incident, at the time they approached to Japan, they invited the emperor. So that is the same tactics, what China doing that. And you mentioned that the Belt and Road Initiative, Japan participates in the Belt and Road Initiative. But I think they have certain condition. The Prime Minister Abe mentioned that the openness and the transparency. So that Japan is not involving one way, go all the way through. So that is my comment on that. Thank you.
Yes, I absolutely agree. That's why I was effectively siding with you at during the conclusion. I wasn't particularly sanguine about the prospects of a long-lasting détente. It's not least because there are no real deliverables. As you say, Abe's cooperation for the Belt and Road Initiative has been qualified. And in fact, the studies that are ongoing on the Japan and China side to see what effectively that means will involve, in all likelihood, cooperation in a third party, so in a third country, involving Japanese and Chinese enterprises working together for sustainable development and development that is friendly to the environment. So absolutely, it has already been qualified in many ways by Abe. What I think is going on in terms of Abe claiming that Japan will cooperate on the Belt and Road Initiative is that Abe would like to have at least summit diplomacy with Xi Jinping, even just for handshakes and promises of a degree of stability in Sino-Japanese relations. And in order to do so, Xi Jinping needs to sell to his own people something. And that is that Abe has agreed to Xi Jinping's project, because the Belt and Road project is Xi Jinping's belt, right? He's wearing it. To the extent that it has been included in the party constitution, right? Together with Xi Jinping fought. And so in this way, Xi Jinping can claim victory to a certain extent to his domestic audiences, including rival factions within the Chinese Communist Party, I think. I think what might be at play as well, if we want to be cynical, and I'm Italian, so allow me to. It's part of my identity. What might be at play as well is that Abe also needs leverage vis-à-vis Trump. I agree, absolutely, that China is on a charm offensive precisely because US-China relations are going in the wrong direction in Taiwan, in terms of trade wars, in terms also of the South China Sea, perhaps. But perhaps Abe needs leverage, not just because he's concerned about the ripple effects on China of the trade war between the US and China, and Japan has lots of stakes there, but also because Trump has made it clear that he wants to reduce the deficit vis-à-vis Japan as well, and he wants a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan. And so to increase his own leverage, Abe might need to at least pretend to put a bit of stability in Sino-Japanese relations, to deal with Trump also. this is my thinking. Thank you. Please.
Thanks, Giulio. Stephen Nagy from the International Christian University. So in terms of the communication from the Japanese side about the BRI, in my understanding that Prime Minister Abe has been very delicate, and he selected his discussions and points about the BRI very carefully. So when he communicates to his Chinese counterpart, he talks about, well, the possibility of joining the BRI and linking it up to the free and open Indo-Pacific, or how can we include the Quad into the BRI. So I think that he's definitely reaching out, and he's demonstrating Japan's interested, but at the same time, he's making it very difficult for the Chinese to agree to these other initiatives. So I think that we should be a little bit more cautious in terms of how Japan is engaging in the BRI, but in general, I agree with you. I like this idea of might, mind, and power, and I think that you've really taken that, you've gone through that analysis really in an interesting and enlightening way. I think the point that you may want to bring out a little bit more is that there's probably more consistency on the Japanese side in terms of the direction of how it's had its self-narrative, in particular about its democratic identity. And we see that in 2012, 2013, Prime Minister Abe's first visit was to Indonesia, talking about democratic values. Where on the Chinese side, I think that we've seen a real change under Hu Jintao. We've had the peaceful rise, peaceful development. Today we have China coming out, new reform and opening up, and Xi Jinping has fundamentally changed the self-narrative. So maybe that's some place that you could think about it.
Absolutely.
Moving. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, on the BRI, I absolutely agree. Xi Jinping has actually been pressing Japan in terms of key deliverables, right? But they want to see results, a result-oriented cooperation with the BRI. On the democratic values, what is interesting, the point I would make is that, yes, we are seeing China pushing the envelope and pushing, being particularly also having strong ripple effects in terms of its foreign policy influence in Southeast Asia or in Central Asia by allowing for mega infrastructure projects that would eventually empower autocrats. But we also see the competition in itself and Japan playing by the Chinese game that empowers the likes of Duterte, for instance, right? And the fact that Duterte comes to power, he goes to China cap in hand, he takes a lot of promises back home, and then eventually Abe goes and visits Duterte's hometown. And Duterte, we can be very, very clear about Duterte that he's not democratic. Right? He's particularly, I would say, I would call him scary, to say the least. But he's also empowered by the government of Japan because you don't want to lose the Philippines siding on China's side. And so you see power politics in a sense of a sort of like use of economic levers that plays to the advantage also of local despots and strongmen. And de facto eventually making us all very, feeding into political involution. Yes, and on the narrative, on the Chinese narrative, yes, I see that Hu Jintao's harmonious world and China's peaceful rise was already losing steam by 2008, 2009. But it's really with Xi Jinping that 2 weeks into office we get the China dream, right? And the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as key sort of memes, of key refrains of jingles, if you want, that are played in China. And there is a strong need for China to reassert itself into the international stage. That is clearly part of it. I would even go a step further. I would say that the China dream feeds into a China nightmare at the same time, which is the so-called the century of humiliation. And Japan has been particularly effective in being the sort of mirror image of a China dream, right? It was the Xi Jinping administration that has effectively inaugurated the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Day, the Victory Day Parade, and I see that insistence on the brutal legacy of the Japanese empire as the China nightmare that feeds into the China dream. And so that's also a reason why it's extremely hard then now to tone down the propaganda back in China. And they're trying very hard, not least because they have demonized Abe to the extent that, this is Aurelio's analysis, that Abe has been presented as having a militarist dream, right? Xi Jinping has a China dream, but Abe has a militarist dream. So how do you shake hands with Abe now that you have demonized it? It's very hard to walk back on its own propaganda. Yes?
Yes, Rob Leffler, University of Arkansas. You have, I think, correctly pointed out that the Trump administration seems to be placing more responsibility, or wishes to place more responsibility on Japan for its own defense. And in the context of U.S., Japan, China triangular relations, it would seem that the confidence that the various partners have in America's willingness to continue its defense responsibilities is threatened. In light of that, I wonder if you would like to comment on the implications for, within Japan, constitutional revision.
Right. So the implications, to get you to get you right, the implications of U.S. demands for greater alliance burden sharing on the part of Japan, and the implications of that pressure for constitutional revision in Japan.
Yes.
In what particular way? In terms of Japanese public opinion seeing this as U.S. pressure at play, or in terms of Abe feeling this as pressure, something that he needs to deliver on?
Yes. How do you view that dynamic as potentially changing the climate of Japanese public opinion and political pressure for constitutional revision?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So I don't see the Japanese public being overwhelmingly sympathetic to substantial constitutional revision. In fact, we're talking about effectively an almost cosmetic constitutional revision, where Japan de facto calls things with its own name, as Confucius would have it. That is, that the self-defense forces are a military force. But still, it's still unpalatable, I would say, to the public, for the public to endorse constitutional revision. We have public opinion polls, and you have to correct me if I'm mistaken, but still show a slight majority sometimes, but not more than rare beeps up. So I would still think that the threat perception is not particularly felt within the Japanese population. I think that a clear indicator of these dynamics have been the demonstrations and the plunging in popularity of the Abe administration once it passed security-related bills, starting with the secrecy law in December 2013 or so. And we've seen exactly the same dynamic at play with the peace and security bills in 2015. And one aspect that probably worries the public, paradoxically, is the fact that it's Abe demanding constitutional revision. And so if it had been a different politician, it would have been easier, perhaps, to sell it. But we have seen changes, substantial changes, even within the boundaries of the present constitution, for instance, through the 2014 constitutional reinterpretation and through the related package of peace and security bills in 2015. And I've spoken with Japanese academics that don't even think that constitutional revision is necessary at this stage, because things can actually snowball and move on within the 2014 and 2015 changes in itself. So I think that it's still unpalatable, and it's still the short answer that is I don't see it coming easily. Perhaps there's going to be a very minimalistic constitutional revision, not least because of the high threshold, right? The supermajority that is needed in the Diet and the 50% plus one majority that is needed at the referendum.
Then you don't see it as something forming the center of Japan's political stage in the near future?
At this stage, I wouldn't bet on it, especially if the public opinion polls do not show a marked majority in favor of constitutional interpretation. Certainly, Abe wouldn't want to leave office with a negative legacy, a legacy of failure. So I would say that he would even backtrack on his sort of pet project of constitutional revision, and he has already backtracked by watering down the nature of constitutional revision.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, there is one person and then another one. Yes, we have one and then, yes.
Okay, I'll just leave it as there. Okay, thank you, first of all, for your presentation. Although your talk was mostly on Japan and China power politics, I wanted to know, in your opinion, like with the recent developments going on between North Korea and South Korea, how do the relations between both of those states affect Japan-China politics, if at all? Thank you.
Right. So Japan-China relations through the prism of North and South Korean relations. I think what we're seeing here is a cozying up progressively of South Korea to China. There was a there was a 3-year window where the Park Geun-hye administration, well, a 2-year window where the Park Geun-hye administration took a more confrontational North Korean policy because it was not getting results from China. I see the present administration, the Moon Jae-in administration, as working on the footsteps of his political mentor, who was a former president of South Korea, engaging North Korea within, at least at present, within the present sanction regime. So it will engage North Korea, but not to the extent that we are going to see a new sunshine policy. To the extent that pressure from China is key to get anything out of North Korea, because China has been North Korea's economic lifeline. To the extent that pressure through China needs to be at play, there is an argument that can be made, whereas Japan sees the benefits of a small stability in Japan-China relations, also for the sake of denuclearization in the North. Whether this is viable and effective, I am less comfortable with. But you can argue that in 2017, Japan has made steps towards China, not just because of the Trump unknowns, but also because China was effectively in favor of maximum pressure, well, you could say pressure at least in China's case, towards North Korea. And Japan appreciated that. Now, the advent of the Moon Jae-in administration is probably changing the game, because we have a very pro-engagement government in the South. I think that China will probably be less. North Korea will be less of a factor at this stage in Japan-China relations. But the peninsula is not really my focus.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Makoto Honja, I'm a businessman. Two questions. The first question doesn't particularly address China and Japan, but I think it has some implication. What is your assessment of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative's push into Central Asia, if you are taking it from the Russian standpoint? Q1. And the second question is, when we are talking about the democracy initiative on the part of Japan, I think Abe himself has some, and his entourage has a dichotomy because of their more revisionist view of history, and which tends to undermine their standpoint of being the heralds of democracy. And I was wondering how you would sort of consider that within the whole equilibrium of Japan's policy initiatives.
On the second question, you were talking about the mismatch between Abe as a strong leader domestically and also his worldview. Right, his Weltanschauung. Right, okay. And the implications of that, or whether, yeah. Right. Okay, on the first question, very briefly, Central Asia has traditionally been Russians' backyard. And now it's effectively becoming China's backyard. What we also see is that the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, initially in 2006, was trying to actually go all the way to Central Asia. So there was a strategic interest on the Japanese side to complement the US presence in Afghanistan with increased aid and assistance in Central Asia. But it went nowhere. Also for, the massive Chinese presence and the fact that Central Asian is economically unpalatable. Apart from natural resources, the construction of infrastructures in the middle of the desert are probably not economically conducive for China itself. And so China will probably find itself with what we call in Italy cathedrals in the desert. So massive projects that would eventually be unused, would eventually bring no economic goodies to neither Central Asia nor China. But certainly China has a massive presence in the region. Now, the topic I can talk more comfortably with is the second one, not least because I have written on Abe's entourage and to a certain extent on Abe's worldview in foreign policy. And you're free to Google these articles on the internet. If you're unable to download them, please send me an email. Because they are behind a paywall, but they should be uploaded in my university research repository webpage. As you say, yes, there is a case to make about cognitive dissonance, if you want. But But as a politician, Abe understands that the institutional Abe is different from personal Abe. And especially since 2015, and since the effectiveness, if you want, of two things, of US pressure on the Abe government, and Abe sitting more comfortably in the Prime Minister office, you see a Prime Minister and an entourage who is much more comfortable in making concessions on the history issue. We've seen this at play with US arm twisting of the Japanese and Korean government to reach a deal on the comfort women in December of December of 2015, maybe. We've seen, yes, I think it was December of 2015. And we've seen Abe paying visits to Pearl Harbor and Obama paying visit to Hiroshima. So we've seen Abe coming back from the wilderness, because he was the prince of the conservative camp. And he was still supported by staunchly conservative, you might say, right-wing supporters between 2007 and 2012, since between in the years of his before his comeback. And so he naturally had to take a stance at the beginning of his second mandate, because these were the only supporters he had, and he received the support of these organizations, some of which he chaired, such as Sosei Nippon, to eventually become prime minister again against Ishiba in the presidential race of the LDP in 2012. But once he sat more comfortably in the prime minister office, he doesn't need to make concessions anymore. So the institutional Abe has become a much more pragmatic politician. And you might even argue that Xi Jinping is, if you want, it's the reverse case. Many people who knew Xi Jinping thought that he was going to be a reformer. And in a sense, he became the consensual leader who had to get a tight grip and had to go through massive anti-corruption campaigns and centralization of power and the inauguration of very harsh repressive security measures within China to maintain the CCP in power. But there is an argument that can be made that there is a cognitive dissonance there as well, that the personal outlook of Xi Jinping is actually more liberal than it looks from the outside, from the institutional one, which is, I find, fascinating. But you never know, right, in China's case, because the system is very opaque. Yes, please.
John West from Sophia University. Congratulations on an excellent presentation. Many people are worried about the fragilities of the Chinese economy, and some people even think there could be a crisis coming. To what extent do you think that Xi Jinping might be motivated in his foreign policy by his own perceptions of domestic economic weakness?
That's a fundamental question, and that is a question that you answered yourself. But yeah, absolutely, that the Chinese leadership has traditionally used nationalism as the second pillar for CCP legitimacy, especially since the late 1980s, eventually with the advent of Jiang Zemin, who also had personal reasons to hate Japan and to push for patriotic education. But it has become a fixture of the Chinese political system since the 1990s, since Tiananmen, to the extent that the argument amongst China watchers in Japan is usually focusing on interfactional struggles within the Chinese Communist Party as key to understand China's foreign policy behavior. And so the thinking is that since Jiang Zemin's patriotic education, you have his faction playing up nationalism to weaken moderate factions such as the Hu Jintao, the Chinese Communist Party Youth Association faction, or even Xi Jinping. And this is the argument made by the current president of the National Defense Academy, Kokubun Ryosei, in a recent book he wrote on Japan-China relations seen through the prism of Chinese domestic politics. Effectively, he argues that at times of leadership transition, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping had to take a strong stance, a strong nationalistic stance in foreign policy in light of nationalistic opposition from minoritarian, hawkish rival factions, usually the Jiang Zemin Shanghai faction. And it's only when Hu Jintao and more recently Xi Jinping are able to consolidate power, China can make overtures to Japan. And so the thinking is not international politics, as Admiral Ota mentioned earlier, or as evident from this presentation, but it's Chinese domestic politics. I see, however, a longer trend in Chinese domestic politics where Chinese hyper-nationalism is more evenly spread across factions, and I would call Xi Jinping himself a nationalist, actually. Perhaps not an anti-Japan nationalist per se, but clearly a nationalist that wants to secure Chinese interests and wants to get China respected vis-à-vis its neighbors. And so I see nationalism playing a role at the personal level, at the leadership level. I mean, this is usually discounted, but it's important. And Chinese nationalism playing also at the wider societal level, where clearly it does help pushing in the East and South China Sea, while Chinese economic development when Chinese economic growth is slowing down. And we've seen this also at play because of interfactional struggles. I mean, Xi Jinping effectively stole Bo Xilai's clothes in 2012. There was a possibly very dangerous struggle within the Chinese Communist Party, to the point that rivals such as Bo Xilai and the former head of the security service, basically, were going to almost steal more seats within the Chinese Politburo and weakened considerably what was the designated successor of Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping eventually wore the nationalistic mantle that Bo Xilai was wearing. Even the insistence on a personality cult comes straight from Bo Xilai. And that's why you see Xi Jinping, you might think that Xi Jinping was, possibly personally he was a different person, but he had to play that game because Chinese politics were getting very nasty. And so that's why nationalism then becomes a safety valve, so to speak. Because there was not just the slowing economic growth, but it went hand in hand with instability within the Chinese Communist Party.
James Brown, Temple University, Japan. And well, firstly, thanks very much for contributing the chapter to our book that you very kindly mentioned on the slide there. My question, however, is to do with Yachi Shotaro, who is mentioned in the top article there. You mentioned him a couple of times during the presentation, but as someone who has really studied him quite intensively, I wanted to ask a little bit, for a bit more detail about how important he remains, what sort of individual he is, his relationship with Abe, and perhaps finally, what do you think is going to happen to that role of national security advisor after it shifts to someone else?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a question that is very dear to my research heart. I was lucky enough to start fieldwork in Japan prior, 3-4 months prior to Abe's comeback to the prime ministership. And I was lucky enough to had secured already access to Yachi Shotaro through being accepted to a cram school, so to speak, a special course he delivered for Waseda, Tokyo, and Keio University students. And so I basically did what an anthropologist would have done. I did participatory observation to get a sense of what was his outlook, what was his thinking. I was also involved in a gashuku, so I was incredibly lucky. And then unexpectedly, Abe jumps back to power. So I can speak with a degree of knowledge about this issue. Abe, as evident from leaked State Department cables and first-hand interviews, de facto had a very strong bond with Yachi, back from his time as Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary, where Yachi was his assistant. Yachi was closer to Aso initially. Yachi was de facto Aso's diplomatic brain. The Arc of Freedom and Prosperity came from Yachi and his right-hand man's hat, which is Kanehara. And it's particularly surprising because it stands out for its sort of neoconservative almost language. Its emphasis on universal values, on democracy, human rights, and whatnot. And it echoed discourses from the George W. Bush administration, but it also reflected very clearly the thinking, the geopolitical thinking that Abe borrowed from Yachi and Kanehara, and the need to deepen the US-Japan alliance, because there were, in my opinion, fears in Japan that the US would have disengaged from the Japanese threat assessments of China, meaning that it's in the mid-2000s that Japan understands the US as less reliable in pushing for a more balancing oriented foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And so in order to sort of get in and lock the US into a US-Japan embrace, Japan wanted to emphasize universal values, sort of to make the alliance even more comprehensive. And so this is clearly part of that thinking. Another important part of that thinking is the need to engage with China from a position of strength. And this meant not just deepening the US-Japan alliance, but also building up relationships with countries around China's periphery. And as you probably know, that included also Russia. In fact, Abe has been consistent in its engagement of Russia. Yachi was on the record in 2007, I think, he made this controversial remark, but he didn't care if Japan got back 3.5 islands. And in fact, the Japanese position has been changed to a very flexible one, back to the 1956 promise, where Japan gets back 2 islands, and then eventually the future promise that it might get other 2 islands back from Russia. But of course, this thinking clearly sees China as the target of these initiatives. So it's engagement of Russia, it's engagement of strategic states in the periphery of China. And it is also, interestingly enough, a relationship and a role that Yachi has played in first person. So Yachi has been relabeled as Tobojikan, as a administrative vice minister for foreign affairs, so the top diplomat, who wasn't just in charge of the institutional workings of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but who would personally engage in negotiations with South Korea, China, Russia. And he has continued doing so following Abe's comeback. So he has clearly affected Abe's foreign policy by injecting strategic thinking along the earlier lines, by insisting also on universal values, and this comes also from Kanehara. But he has also, in a sense, done something that is very unusual in Japanese diplomatic history, perhaps, is that he has combined strategic thinking and just strategic overtures with first-hand role played at the negotiation table. And that's why I've labeled him Japan's Kissinger, because he has been on the front row of Japanese diplomacy. And to that extent, his role as a national security advisor reflects something that probably was never there in Japan. I mean, we had people like we had influential academics like Wakaizumi Kei negotiating the secret agreements with the Sato, for the Sato administration and the Nixon counterpart, but he wasn't as influential as Yachi, for instance, in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of what Sato should have done in its broad foreign policy outlook. And so he really embodies, in a sense, Abe's foreign policy, along with, of course, his right-hand man and the diplomatic machine and the bureaucratic machine that revolves around him. On the NSA, we have an expert on the NSA sitting in front row who has published a brilliant article on the National Security Council, Adam Liff, and I suggest you all read it because it's already available online. And he asks the same question, whether the National Security Council will be sufficiently institutionalized to allow a successor to make full use of this machine. Now, what I can say from my own personal research and from my limited understanding of the National Security Council of the United States of America is that in its first years of being, it really depended on the President of the United States of what to make of a National Security Council. I've also read the Rothkopf book a long time ago, which you cite in your article, where you have presidents that prefer to defer foreign policy to informal gatherings, for instance, or to the State Department. And you have, in 2007, a politician such as Fukuda Yasuo, who effectively killed in the cradle the bill that would have allowed the implementation of a National Security Council, because he didn't like it. Because now Fukuda Yasuo, and he has been critical also of the trajectory of Abe's control of the bureaucracy in recent years. Fukuda Yasuo is a much more consensual leader. And he went on the record by saying that Japan should take advantage of the expertise throughout the bureaucracy without politicizing the bureaucracy through a National Security Council. So in the case we see a personality that is very distinct from Abe, we might see a very different use of a National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. That's the long answer.
Thanks a lot. Let me ask the last question, taking advantage of being here. At the beginning, you looked at these issues of public diplomacy, Japanese investments in buying commentators, which is something which everybody does in Washington. I mean, there's a price, if you no, I mean, seriously, if you want like a former deputy assistant to the deputy assistant in charge of acquiring shoelaces, that's fairly cheap. If you want former Secretary of State, you have to pay a little more. On the Financial Times Nikkei thing, I have a different interpretation. I think what happened is that Nikkei realized it had several problems. First, its international coverage was not very good. I mean, there are excellent journalists stationed overseas for Nikkei, but overall, it wasn't in the same league as the FT. Two, it has a problem which every Japanese business has. Its customers are dying. Sure. I mean, they're not dying because they're reading the Nikkei. They're dying of old age. Even though the press has held pretty well here compared to Europe and the US, younger Japanese are less likely to subscribe to it, buy the 2 editions, everything. So where's the future? Well, the future is overseas. Now, the thing is, if you manufacture cars, you can sell cars. I mean, a good Japanese car is a good Japanese car anywhere. Well, a good Nikkei overseas isn't very good because it's in Japanese, and there are not that many individuals who read Japanese well enough to read Nikkei. So they started Nikkei Asian Review, and they realized they wanted to become a global brand. And it was clearly obvious to them they didn't have the staff. Not only the language ability, but the capability to write an article that's edited in a way that non-Japanese readers like it. I mean, if you translate a Japanese newspaper article into English, most readers outside of Japan will think it's very badly written. Maybe fair or unfair, but that's how it works. So they basically bought the FT to get the technology. I mean, it's a typical, it's like a car company buys a mapping software business. Right. And they bought the FT. Most observers thought they overpaid for it. Apparently didn't realize until the end that they weren't buying the building. And that I don't think there's kind of a dark ambition to control it. I think it was really a purely business thing. Now, they got money from policy banks. That's because, in general, everybody in the Japanese establishment realizes that Japanese companies have to go global. So they might have done it for a tech company, for car manufacturing. I think they did it for the Nikkei. And I think the result, to some extent, is probably going to be the colonization of the Nikkei by the FT. Because the FT has more advanced technology, quote unquote. And I think the ones who are probably really afraid are some very Japanese Nikkei journalists, because suddenly you have these people who arrive from London with what is considered to be better technology, quote unquote, and what's going to happen to them. They may not know English very well, they may not be used to editing, and suddenly these guys from the FT, as well as the globalized Japanese, are going to take it over, and your middle-aged Japanese male Nikkei guy is going to fall by the wayside. I think the other issue you raise is, what do you get, from essentially buying op-eds? Or buying influence. And I don't know if there's any study that's come out. I'm not clear that it's always good. Yeah. And I think you've had a problem sometimes. You've had this with Confucius Institutes, for example, where actually it's backfired. You've seen that in Australia big time. I mean, I think if I were working for the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party, I would look at what's happened in Australia and say, this is a catastrophe. Absolutely. Now, everybody suspects anyone who's getting money from China, even for legitimate purposes of being a Chinese Communist Party agent. So I think that's kind of a complex. But I wonder whether you have any final comments on this or on other issues.
Sure. Absolutely. On the latter question, on the latter point, I wholly agree. The case I mentioned was actually secret money, and it was unveiled through a couple of scoops by the Sunday Times. So if it weren't for the scoop, we would have not known that the money was coming from the Japanese embassy, not least because these commentary were not signed by the think tank, but they were signed by third parties like
Yeah.
former
That's very common. I mean, I remember in Washington, I was working a book on Central Asia, and some guy called me, and I don't get as much money as a former chief of defense staff, but he was offering money to basically sign an op-ed, and I
Say
think
how
the
beautiful
funding came
Central Asia is.
from a Central Asian embassy, but through
Yes.
a kind of money laundering process.
And what is even more interesting is that the message had a negative quality. So for Japan, it is a first, I would say. Because Japan had played mostly on the cool Japan and the sort of constructive come to Japan messaging. This is actually the message, if you read the two scoops by the Sunday Times, it was all about China. It didn't even mention Japan, basically. It's like China could switch off your lights if we go forward through Hinkley Point. So, for Japan, this is an interesting development, I would say. On your first point, of course, I don't see a dark side. No, I mean, many of the things I mention here have both, for instance, have several interpretations. And the economic initiatives clearly have an economic angle. Even Japan's push for infrastructure exports in Southeast Asia clearly have an economic angle in terms of reinforcing the Japanese development state through export-led growth or whatnot. That said, if you read a set of fascinating reportage by Facta, which is the magazine that was responsible for unveiling the Olympus scandal. I was told that the author is a disgruntled former Nihon Keizai Shimbun journalist. You see that citations of somebody from the Japanese government being particularly happy about having the prospects and the possibility of a major daily newspaper which has substantial credibility worldwide being owned by Japan, by a Japanese company. You have citations of preoccupations on the Japanese side about some editorials and commentary denouncing Japanese Prime Minister Abe's the Japanese government's christening of the helicopter carrier with a controversial name, which in my opinion was a storm in a teapot, but still, the Japanese government, according to these commentary from Facta, was particularly concerned. And it was also concerned by the possibility that Pearson would have sold the Financial Times to the Chinese. What happened is that Pearson made it clear that it would have not sold the Financial Times to neither the Chinese nor the Russians. But still, there was a willingness to play by the sort of whole of Japan, according to the Facta. I think it's a series of 4 articles. And as you mentioned, the intangible assets that the Nikkei paid for the Financial Times are staggering. I mean, we're talking about 1.3 billion US dollars, which is substantial. They clearly overpaid the Financial Times. And they could have gone for a different newspaper, for instance. But that said, I mean, I think that Fiat and the Elkann family owns The Economist. But
It's typical in M&A transactions for assets to be overpaid for.
Yeah.
I mean, that's any M&A banker will tell you this. So I think the Nikkei probably overpaid, but that's common. I mean, the history of Wall Street is littered with cases of CEOs overpaying for what turns out to be a really bad deal.
Yes.
Except for the shareholders of the selling company.
Yes, and to conclude to sort of like push my argument, it has become evident that the JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Corporation, has been used effectively as Abe's purse. You say JBIC pushing for projects in Russia, for instance, in the Far East, and there is a sort of strategic angle. You see JBIC changing its loan policy in Southeast Asia, and it plays along the Abe government's strategic outlook. And so in that sense, I see evidence of clearly an interest, because the two things can go hand in hand. what you said. The export-led growth, the economic development of Nikkei, and the need for Japan also to bring its message to the global decision makers, if you want, because it's probably one of the most influential newspapers we have around.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to first and foremost thank Giulio. I'd like to thank Eriko, John, and all the student workers, and the audience, because I think what makes these events different from what we often see in other parts of Tokyo is that we have a very active audience and a lot of questions. So thanks a lot.